All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's time for DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here. And today, folks, we're going to talk all about IoT and eSIM, a really interesting technology, eSIM. So, for IoT aficionados, this will be a nice deep dive. For novices, we'll try to help you understand what this stuff is all about and what you can do with it. IoT, of course, stands for Internet of Things, and it refers to all the connected devices out there. Obviously, your phones these days, your smartphones, they're all devices. Computers are devices, but sensors are devices. Machines, cars these days, all these autonomous cars, and even cars that are not autonomous have lots and lots of sensors on them. That's Internet of Things. So, what do you do with this stuff? You do all kinds of things. You can track where things are. You can update technology remotely, which is some pretty cool stuff. We'll talk about that. You can track things, keep track of especially assets. So think asset management, for example, or fleets of vehicles. If you want to know where everyone is, buses, cars, rental cars, for example. There are lots and lots of different use cases for IoT and remote locations like on oil rigs, for example, places that are hard to reach by human activity, human movement. IoT can be very, very useful. And we have Alejandro Blanco with us from a company called Teal, who is a specialist in this space. So, Alejandro, welcome to DM Radio. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're working on in the IoT world at Teal.
Thank you for having me, Eric. My name is Alejandro Blanco. I run the pre-sales and the post-sales teams, pre-sales engineering and post-sales support at Teal Communications. We are a Seattle-based company providing eSIM and connectivity services for IoT, mainly device manufacturers and folks like that. And yeah, I'm really excited to be on the show to really talk about IoT and like you said, give folks an introduction and maybe go deep into some of the parts that I think are really interesting right now.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, first of all, eSIM, we were talking before the show. Lots of people are now familiar with an eSIM where you travel abroad and you can buy a little SIM that you can put into your phone. And so all of a sudden your phone works in some other place for a while. And that's pretty nifty, obviously. But there are lots and lots of other applications for this technology. Maybe just walk us through what eSIM is, how it works, and why companies would want to use this for not just phones, but for other devices.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people are getting introduced to eSIM thanks to the travel SIM element of it. I just used it. We were talking about Mobile World Barcelona, which we probably will talk about a little bit later. And myself using it, I think it's very, very nifty way of kind of solving that problem, which is being able to dynamically change your connectivity. And the same thing is happening in the IoT world, right? Companies around the world, have had a need for cellular communication for a long time. There's a lot of use cases that use cellular communication. We can talk. You mentioned a few at the beginning of the show, but really, over the years, I can tell you some of the crazier ones, right? I mean, I know of cow trackers, right? Cow trackers are a lot of animal ones are interesting. Something a lot of people don't think about, for example, would be ankle monitors, right?
Mm.
I've had a pet tracker myself for my dog for over 10 years, right? And these are all devices that need connectivity, and the number of devices that need connectivity is growing exponentially.
Right.
It's rare to find a car manufacturer nowadays that doesn't want to keep a communication link to their cars, for things like telematics or recovery or things like that. And this technology is becoming, more and more pervasive. More devices have it, and then that becomes, a situation where these companies, a lot of times, will manage their own connectivity and will sign their own agreements, and suddenly decide for whatever reason that either because they want to change the connectivity or because they want to go to a new market and keep things simple, they want to go with eSIM, right? So instead of having to go to every single carrier under the sun and sign an agreement, grab their SIM card, ship them to your manufacturing plant, put it in. You can just have one SIM card, and that you can just over the air essentially do the same things that you did before.
Yeah, right. So basically, you can write to the eSIM and change its identity, right? So instead of having to go get a different device, You can imagine, I think you mentioned before the show, if a company wants to switch carriers, switch telco service providers, for example, or maybe there's a merger and acquisition or something, all of a sudden, instead of having to go manually replace all these devices, which is a nightmare, now you can just dynamically push a script and update these things, right?
Yeah, I'll give you a practical example. You know, AT&T just announced recently, a few months ago, that they're shutting down their narrowband network. So for your listeners, the narrowband network is a particular set of bands on the cellular spectrum used primarily by Internet of Things providers. So you're not going to
Hmm.
interact with these bands with your iPhone generally. They're very specific towards IoT use cases. They've said that they're no longer going to support the technology, right? T-Mobile and Verizon here in the States still do. So if you have an eSIM and you have the ability to switch between those actual providers, and there's a lot of discussion, right? People who provide access to a network, there's different levels of access. I'm talking specifically here about actually getting a credential from that carrier onto the SIM card. You can just switch it off, right? So we have seen manufacturers who decided back in the day to go with a narrowband product, a narrowband radio that is now in the
Hmm.
field in their customers' hands. Now they have a situation where if eSIM didn't exist, they would be forced to probably recall the device and issue a new device.
Wow.
But with eSIM, they can just click a button and they're onto another network. And they that maybe wins them a few years, right?
Yeah, that's so important because what you're enabling is agility and usability, right? So I remember years and years ago on this show, we're now in year 17, so I've been doing this a long time. And many years ago, someone joked that in the world of IT, we always tell ourselves one more layer of abstraction can solve all our problems, right? And so with the eSIM, you kind of have that layer of abstraction, right? Because you can change the firmware, I guess it is, on the device, and thus it's born again. It can do something new in a different environment. And again, that is so much more convenient than having to manually take it out. I mean, oh my goodness, can you imagine a recall like you suggest? Those things are incredibly expensive, incredibly cumbersome, and it's just wasted time if you get right down to it. So if you can do this in the abstract with the eSIM, you're saving yourself all kinds of trouble. You're really de-risking many different potential outcomes for a company, right?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have that level of risk mitigation, right? There's also the simplification of the supply chain. When you get to really big enterprises, you can imagine that if they have agreements with 20 carriers, right, they're going to get 20 SIM cards into their manufacturing plant. You know, just having one a simplification of that level of SKUs, a lot of big manufacturing companies do see a lot of value in that. The risk element, like we were talking about, being able to dynamically switch, it's funny that you mentioned about just another layer of abstraction. I think for the last 10 years, there's been a lot of marketing around eSIM where people have added new products and new layers to try to do eSIM things or things that look to be like eSIM without actually going to the root of the of what eSIM was intended to do, right? So now, um, you know, I think we're starting to see real eSIM come along where the carriers are starting to come into play. We have a new specification from the GSMA, the governing body for eSIM, that came out last year. It's going to make it even better to use eSIM on IoT devices, and we're starting to see the whole industry mature. So we're going back to basics, right? We're going back to what eSIM should have been, which is an identity change at the core of things, right? From one carrier to another, providing its services to IoT users, across its spectrum. So I think in a way we're going back to what it was intended to do and going back to basics, which is something I personally like a lot after spending 10 years trying to work through all the marketing terms that have come up around eSIM.
Yeah. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, right? And I
Oh
think
yeah.
you were mentioning in the pre-call here that a lot of these companies use various service providers to handle this part of the package for them, right? In other words, they don't do their own eSIM. They go out and they find companies like Teal, and they use that to handle to build out their products, right?
Yeah, I mean, eSIM is extremely regulated, right? And that's been something that has been good and bad. It's good because it's an extremely secure environment, but it's bad because, certifying and the like is extremely expensive. and the governing body is extremely strict about it. You can imagine that anybody who handles, the credentials to allow somebody to access a cellular network or make themselves appear to be, or do a
Interesting.
number of things that you can do with somebody's cellular credentials and keys, right? Which are
Right.
stored inside a SIM card. So anybody who touches these things has to be regulated and has to be credentialed by the GSMA, who are the same folks that put on Mobile World Congress, which does happen in Barcelona. And Teal
Interesting.
is one of the only, I believe it's the only North American owned and hosted eSIM solution, right? And what I was talking about before the show is, uh, you know, uh, even the carriers themselves, even the tier one carriers, will generally, with very very limited exceptions, not build out their own eSIM platforms. So there are companies like Teal that we build eSIM platforms and we operate eSIM platforms, because of the complexity of it. So the idea that even the largest OEMs, like you could think of the automakers, for example, generally want to stay away from that, and that's where Teal comes in, is making eSIM accessible to OEMs, to
Hmm.
device manufacturers around the world.
Yeah, you bring up such an excellent point here about the regulatory side of the equation here, because you're right. I mean, your cell phone has become, in many ways, your identification. You think about two-factor authentication, for example. How often do people use their cell phone for it? Pretty darn often, right? And it's interesting. I've noticed that depending upon the technology that you're using and software as a service, like for banking, for example, or healthcare or different things of that nature, they like cell phones for authentication as opposed to a laptop or a desktop. These are different form factors that I think because of the operating systems on them and because of the regulation around the chips themselves, around the eSIM, these banks and big regulated companies like that stuff because there is this security baked into it, right? You want to talk about that for a second and why it's so important to have that authenticity because you can do bad things with someone's cell phone information, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the same, the people that are involved in eSIM, Teal doesn't necessarily do this because we're a younger company and we're focused on IoT, but you're going to find a lot of overlay of companies that work in credit card manufacturing with the companies that work in SIM card manufacturing.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, absolutely. And that's because generally the requirements and the level of security have been the same. It's been extremely high, because of the fact that you have that the ability to have those keys inside to essentially, if somebody were to gain unauthorized access to some of those things, they could emulate pretty much any subscriber, right, inside that group.
Yeah.
And yeah, the security levels are intense. There's yearly audits. The GSMA audits are extremely expensive. The level of expertise you need to be able to certify is extremely high. And that includes things like, things that I'm thankfully and probably a good idea not privy to, like key ceremonies where folks from different companies will get together, sometimes at a physical location and exchange, keys physically or in a way that cannot be spoofed. I like to joke that they wear gowns and they do it at midnight, but there's a lot of security involved in it, and that's probably a good thing. And it kind of goes back to, you were mentioning a need, right? A need for security nowadays in the modern world. I think there's going to be more things that are going to happen within the SIM and within the cellular identity, as time goes on, precisely because of that. I've talked to companies, very early companies, that have really interesting ideas about how you can use that space to provide an elevated level of security for certain functions inside your phone, for example.
Yeah, I mean, your phone is your ID in many ways, your phone number. I'm old enough to remember when Congress did one of the best things it's ever done in America, and this has got to be 25 or more years ago, where they said you can take your cell phone number if you go to a different carrier. Because back in the day, the telco company said, "Oh no, we can't allow that. It's too complicated." And Congress said, why don't you just go figure that out?" And they said, "Now you can keep your phone." I mean, what a beautiful rule, because again, your cell phone, like people move around and you've moved from Spain, right? So people move all around the world these days, and it's nice to have a static phone number because it's on your website, maybe people associated with you, and so you don't want to have to change that. So the eSIM is really enabling in many ways you to do things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the next level, right? And I think probably in the same way that happened with porting, the tier one carriers were generally not very amenable to it at the start, right?
Interesting.
But at the end of the day, the customer will always, fight for something if they see enough value in it. And that kind of goes back to what I was, talking about the maturity of the eSIM space as a whole. I think we're at a point where the value is apparent. More and more larger customers see it, and they're making it a requirement now. They're making it a
Wow.
requirement, and I think the carriers are starting to really lean into it and starting to ask, hey, what can we get from this? Maybe we can gain something from it, as opposed to just thinking about what they could lose from it.
Yeah, well, one of the very hot topics in the world of enterprise software that we talk about all the time is lock-in. And people don't like lock-in. And so with eSIM, you're enabling companies and organizations and people to escape that lock-in and to go out and find a better price because markets change, pricing changes, needs change for organizations. I mean, I can tell you that I think the open source community in many ways was founded and built around the idea of escaping lock-in, whether that's on the database front, and I think that's really where it started was on the data, but also on the operating system. You look back in the evolution of operating systems. Well, Microsoft was king of the castle for a long, long time, and you had all these operating systems that you had to develop for. So, from an application development perspective, that's a real pain because you develop for a particular OS, and then the OS changes, and you're like, all right, well, what are the new aspects of the change? What do we have to change in our app? It creates a whole bunch of additional work just to keep the trains running on time, just to keep the lights on. And so that's not productive work in opening up new markets or new opportunities. It's just being able to stay in business based on changing environments. And so what happened? Linux comes along, and now Linux is the enterprise standard. It's amazing how enterprise software largely runs on Linux, not on Microsoft. Even I think even Azure embraced Linux like a year and a half ago or something, and everyone was like, "Yay, Microsoft finally embraced Linux." But folks, don't touch the dial. We'll be right back with Alejandro Blanco of Teal. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things Internet of Things. IoT or IIoT is another fun one. Industrial Internet of Things. I love that one. IoT, and we've got Alejandro Blanco with us from a company called Teal. They're based in Seattle, but he's luckily down there in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, enjoying some nicer weather during the winters than they do in Seattle. I lived there for a year. It was cold and rainy pretty much every day, but sometimes the sun shines and it's a beautiful thing. But one big, big development that's coming down the pike right now, Alejandro, is 5G. And a lot of people now know about it, and it's wildly different than 4G. Maybe from an IoT perspective, share with us what's the impacts, how has it affected your life or your business, and what should people know about IoT with respect to 5G?
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about 5G for IoT, right? You were talking about industrial Internet of Things, Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, I think I've heard that the first Internet of Things device was a camera that would show a picture of a coffee pot at the room next door, so they knew if they had to go make coffee, right?
Really? I haven't
Yeah,
heard that.
and
That's fun.
I've also heard it was a connected vending machine. There's a lot of stories going around, but for the most part, right, there's a lot of different devices, none of which probably will ever need 5G, right? I think the coffee pot and the vending machine are okay
Right.
on a lower tier radio access. And for a while, it's been the case for a large amount of IoT devices, right? The amount of IoT devices that needed high data throughput was very low. Up until relatively recently, you really wouldn't see folks sending large amounts of data over the cellular link. They would either, it would be something where either it would be stored locally and then retrieved by the user if they had to, or it would have some other means like a Wi-Fi backup or something like that to get the data out. But that's changing. That's changing a lot and very quickly. I'm seeing a lot more OEMs exploring 5G and cellular technology. I think there's been a few things that have helped with this, not just the advent of 5G as a technology, but also bonding. A lot of folks. We work with a lot of companies that do live TV and things like that. And what we're seeing is devices that are being built with 6, 8, 10 SIM cards in them
No
to make
kidding.
use of bonding, different carriers and different technologies at the same time. 5G is definitely becoming a reality for a lot of companies. AI is making that more the case as well, because now
Hmm.
there's more devices out there that are sending and receiving information from LLMs and things like that. And interestingly, this does really tie into at Teal. We've really worked closely with companies that have always needed performance, right? And one of the issues with for folks that are listening now that maybe have been involved in developing a device for the Internet of Things in the past, they probably, if it was a cellular enabled device, they remember that the quality of the connection is not great because most providers out there, what they're going to do is they're going to hook you up with a global SIM. It's going to be a SIM card that it's going to work in many countries, and it's based on roaming agreements between carriers, right? So your latency could be your device could be sending its data to Europe before it comes back, or it could
Wow.
be, it's going to be roaming on the network, so it's going to have low priority on the towers. We've always worked directly with tier one providers to have low latency, higher quality of service, and things like that being offered through the Teal eSIM, being able to download those profiles onto the eSIM. Um, 5G has been part of that because if you think about it, a lot of times for IoT providers, the 5G SIM cards are new SIM cards. So if customers want to upgrade, a SIM card that's in the field to 5G, they can do that by changing a profile over the air.
Really?
And it's the same SIM card, so it's not like you're dealing with different SIMs. The other part that's interesting, and that we just announced the first unlimited 5G plans for IoT. So other than the carriers themselves, right, we have the first unlimited 5G plans for IoT available through the eSIM marketplace. So another example would be, say that you're an OEM and you're very, attracted by an unlimited plan, which we're seeing more and more of that. Um, you could always switch it over, right? That's
Hmm.
kind of the beauty of eSIM, is that you can say, oh, I like that unlimited plan. Let me hop over to that and just start using it just like that without having to actually touch the device.
Yeah, that's awesome. What about connected cars? Is that something that is enabled by 5G and the SIM technology?
Yeah, connected cars is big. Definitely anything with self-driving or anything where low latency is important. We've
Right.
generally had some sort of communication with them about that. The problem with that is that coverage is not universal. So when it comes to things where it's life and death, like self-driving cars and stuff like that, you can't just exclusively rely on the cellular connection. So we're seeing a lot of communication there, but the actual thinking, right, still has to happen locally in a way because of the fact that the coverage is an issue. We're also seeing a lot of opportunity there, right, with automakers who understand this and they want to get perfect coverage. So they're starting to take that same approach that some of the other manufacturers are doing of adding several SIM slots, diversifying providers, and using eSIM to dynamically modify the provisioning on the car, right? And then, for example, if the car knows that it detects that it's in an area where there's only one carrier, it can move all its SIM cards onto that carrier, or if it realizes that
No
there's
kidding.
two, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it
Wow.
can dynamically test, and a lot of our SIM card does allow that, but a lot of customers that are really, really interested in high level, high fidelity, high performance connectivity are starting to do that, where they will test the connectivity, and that test will influence the different SIM cards and how they bond traffic and how they bond that data usage.
That's very interesting. I mean, but the thought that just popped in my mind is software-defined networking. We've gone through a phase of software-defined storage, and this is like software-defined networking to a certain extent, right? Where a system can dynamically change how it's interacting with its environment based upon available resources, right?
Yeah, it would be essentially dynamic provisioning, dynamic networking at the radio level. Absolutely.
That is so cool. That's really interesting. Well, because one of the aspects I learned about a long time ago with IoT, and I'm sure that's still true today, you're kind of hinting at it, is that some places don't have very good connectivity. You know, you get out on oil rigs, for example, and you're not going to get the same kind of cellular connection that you get in a major city or any number of places. And so being able to manage for that from an information flow perspective is pretty important because it's intermittent. So you get some of these devices that are only going to be connecting every so often, and you want to be able to manage that. And that's actually another whole thread of conversation is managing IoT data, right? I mean, you're playing a central part with in the eSIM, but the thing about IoT data is that it can be so overwhelming and it's hard to even visualize. I mean, if you're an asset management company and you got lots of trucks around, you can kind of look at it on a map and understand it that way. But you start getting into telcos, and it's hard to have any kind of meaning visualization of 578,000 devices floating around there, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the amount of data that gets generated is huge, and identifying what data is important to send over the cellular link is incredibly important. That's where it really depends on folks' sensitivity, right? To paying for that data transport, I think is the main element of it. I'll never forget early on, in my IoT career, I was asked by a gold mining company in Colombia
Hmm.
to provide a rate, right? And it was an area with no cellular coverage whatsoever. So I think it came out at the time for a high HD video. It was something like $5,000 a minute or something like that per
Wow.
feed because it had to be satellite. And they didn't go for it, right? Obviously, but they had a need for it, I think, through regulation or something like that. So, um, there's how much do you need the data, and there's also like you mentioned, right, the issues with coverage. Um, and coverage is definitely interesting, right? People don't generally think about those edge cases, but when you run an operation where there's hundreds of thousands of devices, you're gonna run into areas with no coverage for one of the carriers. Um, Another kind of interesting, really tidbit story is from my time as a field engineer. I was dispatched to a trucking company in Virginia, western area of Virginia, that had a lot of issues with the connectivity, right? And it took about half an hour after I was in their offices to learn that a tornado had taken out their one and only radio tower.
Oh, geez.
So I was able to put two and two together at that point, and realize what the issue was. But it kind of shows that a lot of companies do depend on singular points of failure in their connectivity, right? And that's where eSIM can really help, right? Whether that be as an emergency situation to switch it off to another carrier if you have to, or just for performance or cost-based reasons, right? But eSIM is gives you the ability to dynamically modify that, and then we generally like to leave customers the options of deciding what data is important, what data isn't. But definitely making it easier to do this is going to make more companies comfortable with using eSIM and using cellular in general. And I
Yeah.
think we're going to see the amount of data rise.
Well, that's for sure. And what's cool here is that the eSIM is kind of like it's the port, or it's governing the port of information flow from outside into the phone and from in phone outside the phone. And so to be able to modify that and optimize that is really important, especially as technologies change, as you get either more connectivity or less connectivity. I mean, this concept you mentioned about dynamic provisioning is, I think, is really fascinating because let's face it, if you're traveling on the road, you're trying to keep in touch with people, it's kind of a big deal to make sure you have this continuous connectivity, because if you don't, that's when you run into problems, drop calls, et cetera. I mean, dropped calls are probably the number one biggest problem that people face in the telco world, right? Isn't that probably top of the complaint list is dropped calls?
Yeah, I mean, we deal with anything that isn't a phone, right? So, and I've always worked in
Oh, right.
IoT,
Yeah, that's
so
right.
the consumer side, I've been less exposed to it, but it is funny that you mentioned that because we are starting to see, and I am starting to work more with emergency resource management, kind of groups, generally state groups, that are realizing that their strategy, which up until recently was to generally sign a contract with one of the first responder networks, right, like FirstNet or Verizon Frontline, is good, but not as great as they would like, because a lot of times, and I live in Florida, so I've lived through a hurricane or two by now. A lot of times when you get hit, it's not so much that AT&T has a first responder network. If the first responder network is down, it's just as not it's just as useless as the other one. So they're starting to see a power in diversity, right? They're saying, okay, I want to continue using FirstNet or Verizon Frontline, but can I also have some of X, Y, or Z just in case their network is up in the location that I need to go to, right? So they're starting to see the value in eSIM for emergency operations and things like that as well. Where you would think that it would be enough to just set up a dedicated first responder network, but when it comes to the natural emergencies and congestion on the network, a lot of times that just isn't enough.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, really. I mean, we just saw, of course, in North Carolina, that hurricane that whipped through. I lived in New Orleans on and off for years, and so I've seen what happens when major weather events come through. Of course, in California, we had wildfires. You have all these situations, and emergency services is something that most people take for granted, but I guarantee you the people who are responsible for delivering that service, they don't take it for granted because they're the ones who have to go in there. And communication is crucial. I mean, if you lose communication, your efforts are severely hampered. So this kind of technology, this eSIM that you folks at Teal provide, it gives this additional layer of redundancy and allows you to leverage whatever networks are around when there are really bad things happening, right?
Yeah, and another element that a lot of people don't think about eSIM for IoT is private network, right? And when I mean private networks, I'm talking about setting up your own network in your factory
Hmm.
or at a disaster site, right? Um, it's becoming more and more cost efficient for companies to do this, and eSIM allows you to do that as well. So, we're working with companies that are setting up a private network in a factory, and the devices inside the factory are using that private network, which means that they're not paying a carrier for data.
Oh, interesting.
And then if the device leaves the factory, the eSIM will switch or manage or coordinate or help in some way in that switch to the public networks that are outside.
Wow.
So you get the best of both worlds. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, yeah, well, let's pick this up in the next segment because that is a very interesting use case. Yeah, I'm reminded I was on one of these shows many years ago that one of the guests pointed out to me that in the old days of factories, we're talking like 1800s, these factories would make their own energy. They would burn coal and do other things to make their energy before the grid was ever even a thing. And it's like, huh, you start thinking about solar panels and other ways to get off the grid. Well, communication is one key component. You don't want to have to be paying some provider if you can just do it in your little environment there. Well, folks, don't touch that. I'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back on DM Radio, talking all things IoT, Internet of Things. We've got Alejandro Blanco from Teal on the line. They do eSIM, which is what allows you to switch the devices and get on different networks. And we wanted to talk about native versus remote. And most people know a little bit more about remote from traveling somewhere or roaming. Basically, when you get the roaming charges, boy, back in the day, you could just get hammered with roaming charges. Boy, you go into Canada, don't pay attention to what you're doing. Come home, get a bill for $1,000 for your cell phone. I've had that happen before. You were like, what happened? And there's regulation to come in and say, all right, guys, please don't do that to people. It's really not fair. But tell us about the difference between native connectivity, and we're talking for like T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, et cetera, versus roaming.
Yeah. So, that actually still happened or still happens in a way, that bill shock in IoT too, with some roaming providers. And, I'll get into roaming has been the traditional way of providing connectivity for IoT devices. So you would have a company, and generally these are called MVNOs within the space. So in the same way that a Cricket or a Mint Mobile is an MVNO in the consumer space, there are MVNOs in IoT as well. And these MVNOs would go out and they would sign a contract with a carrier somewhere, generally in Europe, and this carrier would give them their roaming sheet, right? So they would go and sign with German carrier A, and German carrier A has a roaming sheet with all the other carriers because, of course, they have subscribers that go to all these countries, and they have those roaming agreements between themselves. And then this MVNO will it'll build a rate sheet for the manufacturer. And it'll say, okay, France is so much, Argentina is so much, and blah blah blah, and the SIM card will work anywhere. So they'll send it out, and suddenly they'll change the price for some random country. Nobody will get notified, and they'll get a massive bill, right? I've seen that a million times. But the problem with roaming credentials is twofold, right? First of all, is that generally the traffic has to go out through, or has to transit the provider's network in some way. So if you're working with a provider in Europe, or you're working even with a provider who has a core network in the US, which is rare in the space, it's going to go out through one or two points of presence. So your data is not going to be taking the same route that it would on your phone. For example, if you were just a subscriber. And the other part is the prioritization, right? So this is especially important for IoT devices, because IoT devices a lot of times are in places of high congestion. So think of downtowns for your little, DoorDash robots, or at a stadium
Oh,
for a
right.
point of sale system, right? And places where the number of subscribers could fluctuate wildly, or a broadcasting rig at the Baja, right? At the dune buggy races. Or really, there's a lot of situations where IoT plays a part because of the remote element, where there's going to be there's going to be a large variation of the number of subscribers in that area. And especially at a sporting event or a cruise terminal or any number of things, those subscribers are going to be essentially the carrier subscribers. So they're going to care about those subscribers more than they are about your SIM card that you got from a company that is using a European rate sheet, right? And that is classified in something called the QCI. It's a quality something index. Essentially, any subscriber that connects to a network is going to have a priority level associated to it. So if you're working with a roaming provider, that is going to be lower than everybody else. And there's a lot of people who have worked in IoT who have horror stories about congestion precisely because of this, because they're always getting booted off the network.
Oh, wow.
Teal realized this early on, and we worked really hard to get what we call native credentials. So those are credentials that are the same ones that you would get from the carrier, but essentially just through an eSIM. And I like to do a little trick, right? Where I show that you can use a Teal SIM card to pretty much provision any carrier natively, in the sense that you can even put it in a locked phone and it
Hmm.
will work. Not like we allow that for our customers, to be clear, in case anybody from the carriers is listening, but it's exactly the same, right? So that means you get the same level of priority, you get the same number of points of presence for your data to come in and out of the carrier network, as you would if you were buying that SIM card from the IoT group at the carrier themselves. Um,
Interesting.
and that's really, really powerful, for the performance. It's been things like latency. You're gonna be hard pressed to find an IoT provider out there, an MVNO, that is going to give you less than 100 milliseconds in the US, unless you're very lucky. But when it comes to a native credential, right, you're using the full network of the carriers themselves. So you can get, 20, 25 milliseconds relatively easily, and cut your latency by 5.
Hmm.
And also get a better performance. And the best part is you also take the middleman out. So the pricing is very, very low. It's very good in the sense that it's just the pricing that you would get from the carrier through Teal. Doesn't have any more intermediaries. So it's just benefits to using it. And then, but on our side, we like to think at Teal that we're not really as interested, and I don't think we really are, in the connectivity as much as we are in the orchestration element
Hmm.
of it, right? We run the eSIM platform, we build that eSIM platform. What we want is for people to use eSIM. If we give you native credentials and we give you these things on our marketplace, it's mainly so that it'll make it easy for the OEM to take advantage of the solution, right? But if they want to build on top of that, and they want to, explore other options, including building their own profiles, or building their own private networks, like we were talking right before the break,
Yeah.
we're more than happy for them to do that. So we're not out there pushing carry this carrier or that carrier. We would just want people to adopt eSIM.
Yeah, no, that's very, very cool. And I completely get how you're, again, enabling agility and helping organizations avoid lock in, which is important for all kinds of reasons. Price being one, performance being another. Things change over time. And, I also do want to get a little bit deeper into the security side of things because, to your suggestion, people can do bad things. And I've heard horror stories about what was someone telling me? And this is not IoT, but in the cellular world, I know it's not your area of expertise, but about people being able to steal your identity and your phone and use your phone for doing bad things. Well, in the IoT world, that's also really important. Whether it's IoT devices on assets like tractors, or even we're hearing stories of weapons that are sent overseas, and you can have a kill switch probably through an eSIM to say, nope, you can't use that sucker right now. You can sort of uh, turn something off, basically, like decouple it from a network. So there are lots of different aspects of that. But maybe just for about 2 minutes, let's get into the security side. There are layers of security baked into these things, right?
Yeah, yeah, there are absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I've heard some stories on the consumer side about stealing somebody's cell phone identity, and it looks like that's something where there's definitely some holes to be plugged. It's quite secure, but there are some holes to be plugged, especially if we're talking about nation states and things like that that have access to some of the things that are reserved there. But on the IoT side, the security issue on IoT has always been something that has been a solvable one, right? It's something that people have been able to mitigate since day one. But unfortunately, when you have an environment that's open and you allow anybody to bring a network onto the Internet of Things, if you will, you're going to have a
Yes.
lot of different things. There's two main elements around Internet of Things devices and the security, and we do help play an element in that. But a lot of times, it's whatever the OEM or the customer at the end of the day wants to do, right? There was for a while a pretty longstanding practice in IoT, which was exposing devices to the public internet with a public internet with a public IP address and a static public IP address. And when you hear about botnets, right, you
Mm,
hear about these Internet of Things botnets, which the story comes up every couple of months when one of them gets detected. It's always generally this, right? It's generally IoT devices that are exposed to the public internet and that have their default configuration unchanged. So there are many websites out there that, if one were so inclined, would help you find large numbers of IoT devices. Things like security cameras,
right.
even things that you can operate, like door levers and things of higher security risk that are just open, right? And you just hit an IP address, you're gonna get a dashboard or a login screen, and you put in the default password, and suddenly you've got administrator access. So when we work with IoT companies, right, we generally want to make sure that they are making that they're keeping their security in place. We're not a consultancy company, so if you want to do something, we'll give you the tools to do it.
Right.
But generally, you wanna keep your Internet of Things devices securely behind a VPN, and with all their management interfaces and all their management dashboards either turned off or changed from the default
Right.
completely, right?
Don't use the
Um,
default, folks. We'll pick that up in the podcast bonus segment. We'll be right back. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, time for the podcast bonus segment. Alejandro Blanco was on a roll there talking about IoT devices getting hacked because let's face it, that's one thing that concerns me about whether it's Alexa in your home or smart refrigerators, smart door locks, all these things. It's like I guess I'm old fashioned. I don't want the smart door locks just yet, or a key, because like think about the key fob, right? A key fob was a great innovation because you can unlock your car from a distance, But if some thief grabs your key fob, then they can walk around the parking lot just hitting the button until they find your car, and then you just drive off in your car. So it's like there are other holes in the process, I suppose. But Alejandro, you're kind of on a roll there, and you're not a consultancy. You're just giving people the tools to do things that they want with IoT. But IoT, that includes home sensors, right? Like smart homes, smart refrigerators, all that stuff. Those are all IoT devices, right?
They absolutely are. I mean, generally those devices will use Wi-Fi networks, right?
Hmm.
Because it's just cheaper and generally more reliable than a cellular network. But yeah, I mean, the security elements are the same, right? I mean, it's the same security issues. I would not be too concerned about Alexa, just because of the size of the company that runs it. I would
Right.
be more concerned around, any kind of device that is run by a smaller company, or a company that maybe is not under the same scrutiny to provide the same level of security.
Interesting.
Um, Unfortunately, the end user, right? Especially if you're a consumer end user of an IoT device, you're not really going to have the tools or the ability to test any of those things and figure out if the device is secure or not. There's just no practical way to do it. So you have to do it. You have to go based off, I guess, the vibes that the company gives you, right? Are they trustworthy or not when it comes to things
Right.
like that? And just another interesting thing that we didn't necessarily touch on during the main program was the not just the security element of devices getting hacked, but also how easy it is to build an IoT device nowadays,
Hmm.
right? I
Wow.
mean, like right here in my hand, right? With the antenna and the board in this is less than $100 off the shelf. Anybody with basic understanding can build it, and I can drop that. I can drop that anywhere and not need a Wi-Fi network. So, for example, think of it this way, right? Imagine I'm trying to, I don't know, spy on you in your home, right? And I need to put a camera somewhere near your house, right? How am I going to get the information out, right? I can't connect to your Wi-Fi network,
Right.
but somebody could just build an IoT device and put a SIM card in there, and suddenly that part of the issue is solved, right? So it's not just about hacking your devices. The devices are getting easier and smaller easier to build and smaller. And the barrier to entry to building an IoT device and putting it somewhere is tiny. It's basically just a guide away now on the internet.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting and very cool and also somewhat concerning. But as a general rule, to kind of get us back to the eSIM and the role that it plays in IoT, it's this wonderfully adaptable mechanism that allows you to switch networks, to switch formats, to do any number of things to basically update the firmware is I think one way to put it, right?
Yeah, yeah. eSIM is an identity management um, solution at the end of the day, right? Where the identity is the profile that is on the SIM card. And
Hmm.
that allows you to do a huge number of things, whether that be performance-based modifications, right? I want a profile that supports narrowband IoT or Cat M1 or any sort of these services that are offered by the carriers for IoT providers or for IoT OEMs. Or it could be a billing thing. I want to take advantage of this unlimited plan, or this carrier
Right.
is offering me a great deal. So I'm going to
Right.
switch over to them, right?
Right.
There's
That's
many reasons why somebody could want to use eSIM.
Yeah, that's a really, really good example because, let's face it, new companies come on to a particular region, for example, a new network provider, a new telco provider, or some of these remote ones you're talking about. And guess what? Like they may have introductory pricing. You want to switch over. If you can do it fairly easily, do it because that's a huge cost cutting measure. And it enables you to continue monitoring all your devices, to continue doing the things you're doing just for less money and more efficiently, right? Closing thoughts from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we call it a marketplace, right? We have a marketplace where you have your rates posted there. And of course, in the world of B2B, everything is negotiable, but we
That's
like to we like to think of it like an app store, right? Where you just choose the app and say that you really, really want to go with this carrier for whatever reason. You go, you click on it, you wait a few minutes for the device to download the profile, and then you're good to go.
that's
So
so
making it
awesome.
making it quick and easy and reliable for OEMs and device makers who have been hurt really by the false promise of eSIM for the last 10 years, delivering true eSIM and doing that and helping them out and doing it in a secure way is what motivates us every day.
There you go. Well, look this gentleman up online, Alejandro Blanco. It's Teal. tealcom.io. So Teal, like the color, com.io. Very cool stuff, allowing us to be agile in a fully, widely connected world, folks. And send me an email if you want to be in the show, info@dmradio.biz. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to DM Radio.